In the middle of a brutal midnight downpour, Grant Holloway spotted a maid shivering on the curb after the last bus pulled away without her. His truck barely had enough fuel to get him home, yet the single father turned around anyway and drove her to the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. She introduced herself only as Meredith thanked him and disappeared through a mansion gate without another word. The next morning, Grant was humiliated in front of an entire staff by the hotel's general manager, stripped of his dignity for daring to ask for a job. Then the billionaire owner walked in, and the room went silent. The maid from the night before was the woman who owned the hotel. The rain over Portland that night was the kind meteorologists had warned about for days, but nobody expected it to arrive with such fury. Grant Holloway sat behind the wheel of his aging pickup truck, inching through flooded streets after finishing a long repair job at a roadside motel on the edge of town. The fuel light on his dashboard blinked steadily, an unwelcome companion he had learned to ignore because there was nothing he could do about it that night. His wallet held only a few crumpled bills, just enough for gas to get him to his next job the following morning. At a red light near the Vance Meridian Hotel, he saw her, a woman in a soaked maid's uniform, standing beneath a narrow awning, her shoes filled with water, her phone clearly dead in her hand. 3 luxury cars passed her without slowing down, and one driver seemed to aim deliberately for the puddle beside the curb, sending a wave of dirty water across her uniform. Grant hesitated only for a second before turning the truck around, knowing full well what that decision might cost him in fuel he could not replace. The woman climbed in cautiously, introducing herself simply as Meredith, explaining that the last bus had left early because of flooding on the main route, and that every ride-sharing driver who saw her uniform had canceled the moment they arrived. Grant did not ask whether she had money for gas or whether she could pay him back somehow. He reached for the only clean towel in the cabin, handed it to her without ceremony, and turned the heater up as high as it would go. Meredith studied the truck's worn but spotless interior and noticed almost immediately that Grant was trying to hide the blinking fuel gauge from her view. As they drove, she asked why he had stopped when everyone else had driven past. Grant answered simply that Rain did not care whether a person was rich or poor, but people were supposed to care about each other regardless. The words settled into a silence that neither of them tried to fill for several blocks. Somewhere along the drive, Grant mentioned, without asking for sympathy, that he had once held a stable career in hotel operations before he was blacklisted for reporting a safety violation committed by a superior. He offered no details and made no attempt to turn his hardship into a plea for pity. Meredith recognized immediately that he understood hotel systems on a level far beyond casual knowledge, and when they passed the Vance Meridian itself, Grant glanced at the drainage grates along the sidewalk and remarked almost offhandedly that the basement pump system sounded like it was struggling. Meredith filed the comment away in her memory without responding, though something about his easy competence unsettled her in a way she could not name. Instead of directing him toward a modest apartment complex where hotel staff might reasonably live, she asked him to stop at the gate of an isolated, gated estate in one of the city's most exclusive districts. Grant did not question it, assuming she must work a second job for a wealthy family, and when she offered to pay him for the ride, he refused outright. Before stepping out of the truck, Meredith asked for his full name, and Grant gave it freely, then drove away without knowing that the estate's security cameras had already identified the woman standing at the gate as Meredith Vance, billionaire, who owned more than 60 hotels across the country. Once inside, she removed a simple wig and set her maid's identification badge on the table, where her general counsel, Tessa Monroe, was already waiting with a thick folder of documents. Meredith told her flatly that every anonymous complaint filed against the Vance Meridian had turned out to be true, and that the employees under her name were being treated like disposable equipment rather than human beings. Before turning in for the night, she placed a small slip of paper bearing the name Grant Holloway on top of the investigation file, though she could not yet say why the gesture felt important. The investigation had begun 3 months earlier, when dozens of anonymous complaints reached Meredith's office, describing overtime pay erased from records, housekeeping staff forced to clean far more rooms than any policy allowed, workplace injuries, quietly buried maintenance budgets that vanished without explanation, and employees who dared to speak up either fired outright or blacklisted from the industry entirely. General Manager Preston Vale had always submitted flawless reports to the corporate office, and the hotel's profits kept climbing to record highs, which left the board of directors skeptical that anything was truly wrong. Frustrated by the gap between the paperwork and the whispers reaching her privately, Meredith decided to disguise herself as a temporary housekeeper under the name Mara Wells and investigate the hotel from the inside. Over 4 brutal days on the housekeeping floor, she was yelled at in front of coworkers by the department supervisor Dana Whitlock, denied a break despite visible back pain, forced to complete 26 rooms in a single shift, threatened with pay deductions for falling behind, and pressured into signing a falsified timesheet. What she witnessed dismantled the comfortable distance she had always kept from the daily reality of her own hotels, and she began to understand that the empire she took pride in was being built on the exhaustion of people with no power to object, none of whom dared speak honestly, because Preston's connections with local staffing agencies meant one wrong word could end a career permanently. The following morning, Grant returned to the Vance Meridian to interview for a temporary maintenance technician position, and Russell Pike, the longtime head of the technical department, was immediately impressed by his experience. Preston's demeanor shifted the instant he read Grant's name on the application, because years earlier, Grant had reported safety violations at a different property where Preston had served as regional operations director, an incident that had nearly cost Preston his career, and one he had never forgiven. Preston mocked him openly, asking whether a man once fired for refusing to stay quiet truly believed he belonged in a 5-star hotel, and when Grant tried to explain that he had lost his job only after refusing to sign off on a fire alarm system that failed to meet code, Preston refused to let him finish. He summoned several other managers into the room, deliberately turning the interview into a public spectacle, while Dana glanced at Grant's worn shoes and asked aloud whether security should check if he had stolen anything on his way in. Standing nearby in her housekeeping uniform, Meredith watched the entire exchange and fought the urge to reveal herself on the spot, restrained only by Tessa's earlier warning that acting too soon would give Preston and his accomplice, Regional Finance Director Nolan Mercer, time to destroy the financial evidence they still needed. She felt the sting of shame keenly, knowing that the very company bearing her name was humiliating a man who had shown her nothing but decency the night before, with no expectation of anything in return. Preston not only refused to hire Grant, but ordered security to escort him from the building, and as they walked him out, Grant heard an unmistakable vibration coming from behind a wall near the service corridor. The security guard walking beside him, a quiet man named Owen Bradshaw, muttered under his breath that the same rattling sound had been going on for weeks, and that maintenance requests kept disappearing before they ever reached the budget office. Grant thanked him for the honesty but said nothing further, understanding that even a small comment like that could cost a man his job if the wrong person overheard it. Outside, the rain had not let up at all, and Grant stood for a long moment beneath the hotel's grand entrance canopy, staring back at the building he had just been thrown out of twice in 2 days. He warned Russell that the drainage pump system might be overloading, but Preston laughed the comment off, telling him coldly that he did not work there and had no business pretending to understand a hotel that was not his. Grant looked him directly in the eye and said that water did not care who held the title of general manager, and that when a system failed, it would drown everyone regardless of rank. Preston convened a staff meeting the next morning at the service lobby, specifically to make an example of Grant, calling nearly 50 employees together and declaring that Grant was a failure who had once tried to destroy the reputation of a superior. He warned the room that this was what happened to any employee who believed they mattered more than the person signing their paycheck, and no one in the room dared to react, though Meredith stood among the housekeeping staff with her fists clenched tightly at her sides. Dana escalated the situation further by producing the towel Grant had lent Meredith during the storm, which she had brought back to the hotel to have laundered, and returned, twisting the gesture into an accusation that Grant had approached a female employee inappropriately at night. Grant remained calm, explaining only that he had helped a stranger stranded in the rain get home safely, and Dana turned to Meredith in front of everyone, demanding to know whether she had felt threatened. Meredith answered clearly that she had not, and that he was the only person who had shown her any kindness that night, a response that visibly irritated Preston as he shifted his focus onto her, instead calling her a temporary worker who did not understand her place. Grant could have walked away at that point, but he stepped back in asking Preston to direct his anger at him, rather than at a woman who had simply told the truth, offering himself as the target so she would not have to bear it alone. Meredith understood in that moment that his kindness was not performative or transactional. He was willing to absorb consequences to protect someone he still believed was nothing more than an ordinary housekeeper. Russell quietly intervened, reminding Preston that the hotel was dangerously understaffed and that a major investment conference worth hundreds of millions of dollars was scheduled for the coming weekend, even as the technical systems were flashing one warning after another. He proposed a 3-day trial period for Grant and Preston, agreed only under humiliating conditions. Night shifts, a wage lower than the position, deserved no contact with guests, and immediate termination for the smallest mistake. Grant recognized the arrangement for what it was, but accepted anyway, needing the income to keep up with payments on his apartment. Within his first shifts, he uncovered a disturbing pattern of neglect: an unmaintained backup pump, disabled water sensors in the basement, a generator fitted with substandard parts, 3 disconnected zones in the fire alarm system, maintenance logs with altered dates. He documented each violation meticulously and reported them to Russell, who admitted he had repeatedly requested repair funding, only to be told the corporate office had denied it every time a claim Meredith knew was false the instant she heard it relayed back to her, since she herself had approved a planned $4,800,000 maintenance budget 6 months earlier that had apparently never reached the building it was meant to protect. Grant found a supply. Do you label? Do you label? Do you have to? Do you label de-installed pumps, tracing back to a company that sold cut-rate equipment at inflated prices 10 times its actual value? And when Meredith passed the detail along to Tessa, the trail led directly to a company registered under the name of one of Nolan Mercer's relatives. Preston summoned Grant into his office after security footage showed him reviewing technical files, warning him coldly that he had already lost one career for refusing to look away, and that history should not be allowed to repeat itself. Grant answered that history only repeated itself when good people kept choosing silence, and Meredith, overhearing the exchange from the hallway, quietly resolved that Grant would not have to fight this battle alone a second time. Still disguised as a temporary maid, she tested him further, asking whether he regretted driving a stranger home when it had clearly drawn Preston's unwanted attention. Grant told her his only regret was not checking whether she owned a raincoat, and true to his character, he never once asked why a housekeeper appeared to live behind the gates of a private estate, choosing instead to respect whatever privacy she was protecting. Over the following days, Grant repaired a jammed wheel on a housekeeping cart free of charge, adjusted a vacuum so an employee would no longer have to hunch her back to use it, replaced burnt-out bulbs in the staff break room on his own time, brought Russell coffee during the long night shifts, spent his own meal money on an umbrella he left at the employee entrance for anyone who needed it. None of these small acts were performed for an audience, and Grant had no idea that Meredith was quietly observing every one of them. In the cramped break room, she overheard employees confessing they worked second jobs simply because their paychecks kept coming up short, and one older worker admitted to hiding a shoulder injury rather than risk Dana's threats of termination if she asked for time off. Meredith realized the personnel reports reaching her executive office had been falsified for months, and she began to question whether Preston alone was responsible for the cruelty she witnessed, or whether the distance she had allowed to grow between herself and her own employees had simply made it easier for men like him to operate unchecked. Late one night, unable to sleep, she sat on the edge of a narrow staff bunk bed and scrolled through old executive memos. She herself had signed memos praising the Vance Meridian for its efficiency and its record profit margins, and she realized with a sinking feeling that every glowing number had been built on the backs of people too afraid to say otherwise. She thought of the countless galas and shareholder dinners where she had spoken about the company's values, never once imagining that the very hallways beneath those ballrooms were filled with people afraid to ask for a day off. Russell eventually told Meredith the fuller story of who Grant had once been, one of the most respected hotel operations engineers in the region. Until 7 years earlier, he discovered that a resort's fire alarm system failed to meet code just weeks before a scheduled opening. Management pressured him to sign a falsified inspection certificate, and when Grant refused, he was fired within 3 weeks under the pretext of insubordination, while Preston, then a regional director, quietly circulated a warning to other properties that effectively ended Grant's career in the industry. Forced into freelance repair work and long night shifts, Grant rebuilt his life from nothing, taking on jobs that paid far below what his skills were worth, simply because no established hotel chain would risk hiring a man once labeled difficult. He remembered nights spent parked outside 24-hour diners, doing paperwork by the glow of a phone screen, because he could not afford to run the truck's engine for heat and mornings when he skipped breakfast, so his daughter would never notice how little money remained in the household. Bougette. When Meredith asked why he had never sought revenge against the man who ruined him, Grant explained that hatred would never return the years he had lost, and the only thing within his control was refusing to become someone like Preston. He admitted, too, that he had raised a daughter alone after his marriage ended, and that she had since grown up and moved to another state to build her own life. A fact that made him even more determined, never to let bitterness define the man she once looked up to. Meredith found herself drawn to his steadiness, though guilt gnawed at her constantly for continuing to hide who she really was, and during a quiet break they shared a simple dinner on the service stairwell, where Grant offered her half of his sandwich even though it was his only meal for the shift. Preston, growing suspicious of how often Meredith and Grant spoke, became convinced she might be the source of the anonymous complaints, and ordered Dana to set a trap for both of them. Dana planted an expensive guest's watch inside Meredith's employee locker, and when it was conveniently discovered, Preston threatened to call the police unless Meredith signed a confession. Grant stopped her before she could, pointing out 3 inconsistencies. The watch had gone missing. While Meredith was working on an entirely different floor, the locker could not be opened from the front without a key, and the rear hinge showed fresh scratches with machine oil still wet to the touch. He demanded a formal incident report be filed, infuriating Preston, who could not believe a temporary technician would dare challenge him so directly. Working under Tessa's direction, Meredith continued to play the victim so Preston would believe his scheme had succeeded, while a hidden camera sewn into her uniform button recorded Dana pressuring her to sign the false confession and revealing that Preston routinely used blacklisting threats to control employees who considered leaving. In retaliation, Preston ordered Grant to repair the rooftop ventilation system alone during a severe storm, a direct violation of safety protocol that forbade solo work in such conditions. Grant refused, and when Preston tried to write him up for insubordination, Grant insisted the report explicitly note that the assignment had been given during an active lightning warning, a condition Preston refused to put in writing. Russell later showed Grant a stack of maintenance requests Preston had rejected over the years, and comparing them against the hotel's actual equipment, Grant realized the full scope of the scheme. Preston had received sufficient funding to replace the entire pump system, but installed cheap substitutes instead, pocketing the difference, leaving the basement directly beneath the grand ballroom, where the investment conference would soon take place, dangerously vulnerable to flooding. Grant drafted an urgent report recommending a partial shutdown and the relocation of backup electrical equipment to higher ground. But Preston tore it up in front of him, insisting the weekend conference could bring in a contract worth $600 million, and that nothing would be allowed to frighten the investors. Grant told him plainly that a hotel could recover from lost revenue, but it could never recover from a lost life. Meredith wanted to end the investigation immediately and remove Preston from his position on the spot, but Tessa cautioned her to wait, since Nolan was preparing to move the stolen funds overseas, and they needed a few more hours to freeze the accounts. Meredith reluctantly agreed, though she insisted a private security team be stationed near the hotel ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Dana, meanwhile, spotted Meredith using an encrypted phone in the service stairwell and reported to Preston that the woman calling herself Mara Wells was not who she claimed to be. When Preston checked the personnel records, he discovered her paperwork had been entered directly by the corporate office, and panic set in as he realized the full weight of what that might mean. He called Nolan, immediately ordering him to transfer the money that very night and erase every remaining file, unaware that in the basement below the warning light on the failing pump system had just turned from yellow to red, and Grant, watching the rising water, understood there was almost no time left. More than 300 guests, business owners, and investors filled the grand ballroom for the investment conference, and Preston appeared in an expensive suit, taking full credit for every success the hotel had ever achieved while barring Grant from entering any public area to protect the Bout hotel's image. Meredith remained in her uniform, still waiting on word from Tessa that the frozen accounts were secure. When the storm outside exceeded every forecast, and the city's overwhelmed sewer system began pushing water backward into the basement. The cut-rate pump shuddered violently before failing completely, and Grant discovered the rising water was mere centimeters from the main electrical panel. He sounded the alarm at once and demanded sections of the hotel be powered down immediately, but Preston refused, unwilling to interrupt, a conference being broadcast live to the very investors he was courting. In front of Russell and a crowd of staff, Preston announced that Grant was fired for causing panic and ordered security to remove him from the property. But Grant tore off his badge and refused to leave, telling him flatly that he could be fired from a job, but not from standing between innocent people and danger, and several technicians chose to follow Grant's lead rather than obey Preston's orders. Moments later, water reached an exposed circuit board, and a sharp explosion echoed up from the basement, plunging the entire ballroom into darkness. The elevators froze, several electronic doors along the corridors locked shut, and smoke began curling out of the control room as panicked guests surged toward the main exit. Preston vanished into his office to grab a hard drive and a stash of cash, rather than help anyone evacuate, while Grant took charge of the crisis, switching the building to a safer auxiliary power source, manually unlocking emergency exits, distributing emergency lighting, cutting power to the flooded basement zone, organizing evacuation teams floor by floor, keeping everyone away from the disabled elevators, and adjusting a critical valve to keep water from reaching the backup generator room. He had no idea that several investors were watching him manage the disaster, with more competence than the hotel's entire management staff combined, murmuring to one another that this was the kind of steady leadership their own companies desperately needed. One investor, a soft-spoken woman named Carol Ashby, who ran a logistics firm on the East Coast, quietly asked an assistant to note down Grant's name before the lights had even fully returned. Meredith abandoned her cart and worked alongside him, calmly guiding an elderly guest through a service stairwell, and Grant was struck by how precisely she knew the hotel's layout, the location of every valve, and the technical door, codes, a realization that began to reshape everything he thought he understood about her. Russell discovered that the emergency drainage valve was jammed, and if it stayed shut, rising water would destroy the backup generator entirely. So Grant strapped on a safety harness and descended alone into the flooded basement. Meredith tried to stop him, warning that the electrical current might not be fully cut, but Grant told her that hundreds of people were still above them, and he could not gamble with their safety. He waded through the freezing water, forced the valve open by hand, and restarted an old backup pump that Preston had once ordered removed entirely. Preston, meanwhile, locked the fire door behind Grant to trap him inside, hoping the flood would erase both the evidence and the witness in one stroke, and Meredith watched the act unfold. On an emergency security feed, she could no longer ignore. She walked to the central control panel and entered her owner's override code, unlocking every door in the building at once. As a message appeared across the screens throughout the hotel, reading "Override authorized Meredith Vance, Chairwoman and Chief Executive Officer." Grant looked up at the screen, then at the woman standing before him in a soaked housekeeping uniform, and the last secret between them dissolved in an instant. Once emergency power was restored, Meredith walked into the ballroom before hundreds of guests and employees, removed the name badge reading Mara Wells, and produced the verified executive identification card she had kept hidden in her uniform pocket the entire time. Tessa arrived with a corporate security team through the main entrance, as Meredith announced clearly that her name was Meredith Vance and that she owned the hotel, standing around them. The room fell utterly silent. Dana's face drained of color, and Preston, who had just rushed back into the ballroom, froze in place. He tried to twist the truth, claiming Grant had manipulated Meredith and deliberately sabotaged the systems to play the hero. But Grant said nothing in his own defense, simply setting down the torn safety report, photographs of substandard equipment, falsified maintenance logs, copies of rejected budget requests, and documentation linking the shell supplier company to Nolan Mercer. Russell confirmed publicly that Grant had issued warnings days earlier that had gone ignored. Large screens throughout the ballroom then played the recorded footage. Meredith and Tessa had gathered Dana coercing employees into signing falsified timesheets, Preston threatening Grant directly, the staged planting of the watch inside Meredith's locker, Preston ordering evidence destroyed, and, finally, the unmistakable image of Preston locking the fire door, while Grant remained trapped inside the flooding basement. Meredith admitted openly that she had worked undercover as a housekeeper for days, specifically to verify the complaints herself, and she took a measure of responsibility, publicly acknowledging that while Preston had created this cruelty, own distance from the people who worked for her had allowed it to continue unchecked. She stripped Preston and Dana of their positions on the spot, and Tessa confirmed that Nolan's accounts had already been frozen and that financial investigators were en route. When Preston turned to threaten Grant, promising to destroy his career a second time, Meredith stepped physically between them and told him that he had used her name to ruin this man's life once, and from that moment forward, her name would ensure he could never do it to anyone again. To the astonishment of the room, Meredith then told the story of the rainy night, when Grant had driven a stranger home without knowing who she was, without asking for a single dollar, and without even enough fuel to spare for the detour. She made clear that the gesture had not created his technical skill, but it had revealed his character at a moment when no one was watching and nothing was expected in return. Grant refused to let the credit for the night's rescue rest on him alone, insisting that Russell and the technicians who had followed proper safety procedure under pressure deserved equal recognition, and he pressed Meredith not to simply punish a handful of managers and consider the matter closed. He warned her that if the underlying system still forced employees to stay silent to protect their jobs, another Preston would eventually take his place. Meredith looked out at the staff gathered around her and promised in front of everyone that the entire operating structure of her company would change. The day before, Grant had been escorted out of that same lobby like a man who could not be trusted. Now investors rose to their feet as he walked past in soaked work clothes, and Meredith handed him the towel from that first rainy night freshly laundered, telling him she had meant to return it the day before. Grant looked at it and told her it seemed like she needed it more than he did tonight. The subsequent investigation revealed that Preston, Nolan, and Dana had embezzled more than $4,800,000 over 3 years, funneling money through shell companies that overcharged for cut-rate equipment, falsified maintenance invoices, erased employee overtime, collected kickbacks from suppliers, and buried safety violations that endangered guests and staff alike. Preston and Nolan were arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment, while Dana cooperated with investigators but still faced charges for falsifying records and orchestrating the plot against Meredith and Grant. In the weeks that followed, Meredith unveiled a company-wide reform program that repaid every dollar of stolen wages, compensated employees who had been unjustly terminated, established an independent reporting hotline free from managerial interference, banned any manager from unilaterally blacklisting staff, mandated safety audits across every property in the portfolio, seated employee representatives on the operational board, adjusted unreasonable workload quotas for housekeeping departments, and introduced medical support and recovery leave for injured staff. She refused to turn the announcement into a publicity campaign, choosing instead to reveal it first, and only to her own employees, without cameras or press releases in the room. Days later, Meredith called Grant into a private meeting and offered him the position of Vice President of Safety and Operations, overseeing technical systems across the entire hotel portfolio, along with a salary and equity package substantial enough to transform his life completely. Grant declined immediately, and Meredith assumed at first that he was still upset over her deception. But he explained calmly that he did not want a title handed to him simply because he had helped her in the rain or saved a hotel during one chaotic night. He wanted to be judged on merit, not gratitude. And Meredith, rather than pressing him further, respected the boundary and proposed a formal selection process. Instead, one in which Grant would present a full reform proposal, an independent panel would evaluate it, other qualified engineers would be free to apply, and the final decision would rest with the panel rather than with her alone. Grant agreed, and the arrangement marked a quiet but meaningful shift in Meredith, who was learning to separate a personal debt of gratitude from the responsibility of building something genuinely fair. Grant's proposal, which he called the Open Door Safety Initiative, gave every employee across the company the right to pause any operation they believed was dangerous without fear of retaliation. He also recommended digitizing every property's maintenance history, instituting cross-audits between hotels, making safety budgets transparent to staff, rewarding employees who identified risks before they became disasters, training managers in ethics and accountability. and evaluating leadership performance based on staff turnover and employee feedback rather than profit margins alone. The panel selected him unanimously, recognizing that his plan was detailed, realistic, and rooted in lived experience rather than theory. Grant accepted the position on 3 conditions: that Russell be given full authority over the technical department at the Vance Meridian, that every employee Preston had blacklisted be personally contacted and compensated, and that no one use the story of the rainy night for promotional purposes without the explicit consent of the employees involved. Meredith agreed to all 3 without hesitation, and afterward, when she asked whether he still saw her as the housekeeper named Mara Grant, told her he saw the same person he always had, only now she had a great deal more to fix than he had originally realized. 6 months later, the Vance Meridian reopened, following a complete renovation. The basement had been rebuilt with a properly certified pump system, all electrical panels relocated to safer ground employee break areas, expanded work schedules, made humane, and every dollar of withheld wages returned in full. Staff turnover dropped sharply, while guest satisfaction rose in equal measure. Grant refused an executive office, spending most of his time instead in the mechanical rooms, the laundry facilities, and the service corridors, and he required every incoming manager to spend a full week performing frontline work before being allowed to set labor quotas of their own. No one was permitted to establish a workload standard for a job they had never personally done, and Grant began keeping a public record honoring employees who had reported real risks rather than one that only celebrated executives. Meredith, for her part, moved her regional office down from the top floor to a space near daily operations, spending 2 full days each month working alongside different departments without any communications staff accompanying her. And in doing so, she came to understand that true leadership was not about disguising oneself to catch wrongdoing, but about building a system where the powerless never needed a disguised billionaire to finally be heard. A relationship grew slowly between Grant and Meredith, built on mutual respect rather than sudden infatuation or any hint of money changing the equation. They debated operational decisions, shared simple meals at modest restaurants after long shifts, and gradually opened up about the wounds each had carried for years. Meredith admitted she had once believed money could resolve almost any problem, and Grant told her that money could rebuild a broken pump, but only courage could make a person willing to report that it was broken in the first place. On another rainy evening, Meredith found Grant preparing to drive home in the same worn pickup truck, and although she had once offered to buy him a new vehicle outright, he had turned it down without hesitation. Instead, she handed him a small container of gasoline and a new umbrella, telling him that this time she would not let him run out of fuel for helping a stranger. Grant laughed and accepted the modest gift graciously. A newspaper later offered a substantial sum for the exclusive rights to the story of the billionaire who had disguised herself as a housekeeper, but Meredith refused, unwilling to let her own image overshadow the very employees whose suffering had made the story possible. She agreed to a single interview only on the condition that every cent of the proceeds be directed toward a fund supporting whistleblowers across the hospitality industry, and Grant recognized in that decision proof that her transformation was genuine rather than performative. At the hotel's official reopening ceremony, Meredith refused to cut the ribbon alone, inviting Russell, a representative from the housekeeping staff, and Grant to stand beside her instead, and nowhere on any plaque did Preston's name appear again. In its place, a simple inscription was mounted on the wall of the service lobby, reading that no one serves in the shadows, and no one leads from too far away. 1 year after that fateful night, another heavy storm rolled over Portland, and Grant and Meredith left the hotel together after completing their annual safety inspection. Their route happened to pass the exact bus stop where Grant had first noticed a housekeeper standing alone in the downpour, and Meredith asked him to pull over. They stood together beneath the same narrow awning, remembering the night that had quietly rewritten both of their lives. Meredith confessed that on that original evening, she had nearly stopped believing that unconditional kindness still existed at all, having spent days being dismissed and mistreated by people who worked under her own name until she had begun to see every relationship as a transaction rather than a connection. Grant had stopped for her without knowing her name, her position, or the size of her fortune, and that single act had forced her to ask herself honestly whether she had ever extended that same decency to the people who worked for her. Grant admitted that he too had been tempted to grow cold and guarded after the industry that once employed him had betrayed his trust so completely. But he told her that if he had left her standing in the rain, simply because life had once been unfair to him, then Preston would have won that fight years before it ever truly began. Kindness, he said, could not undo what men like Preston had done, but it guaranteed that they never got to decide who he would become. Meredith made no grand offer of wealth, a hotel, or shares in her company that evening. She simply asked whether Grant would like to join her for dinner the following Friday, not as chief executive and subordinate, but as two people who had spent an entire year being changed by each other's presence. Grant pretended to consider it for a moment before asking whether she planned to show up in a housekeeping uniform again, and Meredith told him only if he planned to drive that same truck that was always running dangerously low on fuel. He agreed, without another word. As they prepared to leave another hotel, employee came running toward the same bus stop through the rain, only to watch the final bus of the night pull away without her. Grant and Meredith looked at each other, and without needing to say anything at all, they both stepped out of the vehicle at once. This time Meredith slid behind the wheel, while Grant handed the stranded employee his umbrella, and the small act of kindness that had once begun with a single person now carried forward through two. The open-door safety program eventually spread across the entire Vance hospitality portfolio, catching hundreds of hazards before they ever became tragedies, and dozens of employees once blacklisted under Preston's reign were quietly restored to their careers with their reputations intact. Grant became a leader respected not for his title, but because he never forgot what it felt like to stand outside a locked door. Meredith became a far better chief executive, not because she had once worn a housekeeping uniform, but because she never again allowed herself to forget the people who still wore one every single day. Investors who had once judged the company purely by its quarterly earnings began to speak of it differently, pointing to its retention rates and its employee trust scores as proof that decency and profitability were never truly opposites to begin with. And other hospitality chains quietly began studying the reforms Grant had built, hoping to replicate even a fraction of what had changed inside those hallways. The truck merged back into the rain-slicked road, the hotel's lights fading gently behind them in the mirror. Grant never knew that first night that the woman he had driven home was a billionaire. Meredith never knew that the man behind the wheel of that battered old truck would go on to save her hotel, her career, and her faith in people all at once. But genuine kindness has never once required knowing who the other person truly is. Because sometimes, the stranger who helps you out of the rain today is the very person who will one day open the door the rest of the world had already closed on you.